Hello, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's online worship service. I'm Reverend Dina McFeeters, and I'm honored to serve as Associate Minister. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all that you are carrying with you today and all that your heart longs to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests joining us today. If you're visiting for the first time or joining us from afar, why don't you say hello in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from? I welcome you to our worship service today by inviting you to repeat our mission after me. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. Let's return to our beloved sanctuary for the lighting of the flaming chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism.
Good morning. My name's Kevin Gibson and I'm very happy to be your worship associate today. So in 1984, I was in Nairobi, Kenya, on what could only be described as a shoestring budget. Nairobi is about as big as Milwaukee, and I stopped by the front desk of my hotel. The clerk offered to sell me a tour of the town. With dramatic flair, I pulled out my empty trouser pockets, saying, "I can't, I'm too poor." With a penetrating gaze, she looked at me and responded, You don't know the meaning of poor." It wasn't the only time in my life that I'd been corrected, sometimes kindly and sometimes abruptly, and often made aware of my privilege in the genetic lottery. And empathy is sometimes elusive in such encounters. Here I am, a white middle-class male, middle-aged and living in Middle America. How much can I really understand? I used to teach applied ethics, and one of the topics we covered was what we then referred to as affirmative action. I followed President Johnson's speech promoting civil rights, and paraphrasing, he made an analogy with a road race, where one competitor has been hobbled by chains, presumably by the other's parents. If you can't start the race over, how should we deal with the issue once it's revealed? Limit the one who's been unfairly benefited, or give the harmed one a head start? Or maybe just remove the barriers and get on with it? The idea was that if we could only level the playing field, then we could solve racial discrimination, as would let things roll and merit would reward talented individuals. And you can see why a white guy, whether a professor or a president, might say that. But over time I was made aware of how inadequate the analysis was, mainly by students of color who saw a larger picture. They awakened me from my dogmatic slumbers and connected me to the greater systemic, historic, and cultural riptides at work, so I could never make the cozy analysis I used to. But awakening isn't easy. It's said that when we sense peril, we have a flight, fight, or freeze response. Initially, I challenged some of those conceptual changes, such as using the pronoun they for an individual. I've often glided away, if not flown, from discussions of race, ever since an African-American professor told me that I had no standing and nothing to add. I've been a bystander, frozen in place, when I didn't see how to contribute practically and constructively to a situation. Now, a while back, one of my younger colleagues heard me use the phrase powwow when offering a side discussion. She called me on it and let me know how offensive it could be to Native Americans and how its cultural appropriation trivialized the language of an already marginalized people. Fair enough. She described me as well-intentioned but a work in progress, half woke, or as she put it, more Kevin Woe than Kevin Woke. Still, I appreciate she thought of me as progressing, and I'll take the compliment. Empathy is hard, and it's not easy to walk in another's shoes or properly imagine, life experiences of others. I don't have easy answers, and clearly I'm not there yet. I don't know what it's like to be queer in a heteronormative society. I don't know what it's like to be a person of colour or a gender other than male or grow up poor in Kenya. Still, it seems to me if I listen, and listen hard, I can move in the right direction. Charles Dickens pointed out that we're all fellow passengers on a voyage to the grave, and that makes me think there is a fourth F that we ought to include when confronted with tough demands for empathy. We can fight, flight, or freeze, but maybe fellowship should be there too on our search for the beloved community.
Life is not a highway strewn with flowers. Still it holds a goodly share of bliss. When the sun gives way to April showers, here's the point that you should never miss. Though April showers come your way, they bring the flowers that bloom in May. So if it's raining, have no regrets, because it isn't raining rain, you know. It's raining violets, and where you see clouds upon the hills, there soon will be crowds of daffodils. So keep on looking for the bluebird and listening for his song whenever April showers come along. I have learned to smile when skies are gloomy, smile although my heart's about to break. When I know that trouble's coming to me, here's a happy attitude I take. Though April showers may come your way, they bring the flowers that bloom in May. So if it's raining, have no regrets, because it isn't raining rain, you know. It's raining violets, and where you see clouds upon the hills, you soon will see crowds of daffodils. So keep on looking for the bluebird and listening for his song whenever April showers come along.
In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the Distinguished Ware Lecture at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. His lecture was called "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." He said, "I would like to use as a subject the church remaining awake during a great revolution. I'm sure that each of you has read that arresting little story from the pen of Washington Irving entitled Rip Van Winkle. One thing that we usually remember about the story is that he slept 20 years. But there is another point in that story which is almost always completely overlooked. It is the sign on the inn of the little town on the Hudson from which Rip went up into the mountains for his long sleep. When he went up, the sign had a picture of King George III of England. When he came down, the sign had a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. When Rip Van Winkle looked up at the picture of George Washington, he was amazed. He was completely lost. He knew not who he was. This incident reveals to us that the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that he slept 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. While he was peacefully snoring up in the mountains, a revolution was taking place in the world that would alter the face of human history. Yet Rip knew nothing about it. He was asleep. One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change, and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. The great question is, what do we do when we find ourselves in such a period? There is more that Dr. King said, and we'll return to that in a moment. Let's fast forward to the 21st century, when the metaphor of staying awake through a revolution has evolved into the concept of being woke. In a video clip called "What Does It Mean to Be Woke?" from Essence, Shonda Rhimes said, "To me, being woke means that you recognize that the world is not a simple place, that everything is not all equal, that justice has not happened yet for everyone, and that there is a lot of work to be done." Sabrina Fulton said, "Your eyes are wide open and you're paying attention." April Rain said, "You are reaching out and speaking to people along the way and bringing them on to increase the amount of wokeness in your community." From Merriam-Webster, woke is now defined in this dictionary as aware of and actively attentive to important facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice, and identified as U.S. slang. It originated in African American English and gained more widespread use beginning in 2014 as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. By the end of that same decade, it was also being applied by some as a general pejorative for anyone who is or appears to be politically left-leaning. So here, predictably, is where bullies try to take words of power and subvert their meaning into something negative. We read about this in the news, see it in our communities, and experience it in our schools repeatedly. Banned books, school board conflicts about the red herring called critical race theory versus the necessity of teaching the truth about our country's history. My question is, what are the bullies afraid of? The Associated Press reported in March, over the past year, book challenges and bans have reached levels not seen in decades, according to officials at the American Library Association. According to PEN America, which has been tracking legislation around the country, dozens of bills have been proposed that restrict classroom reading and discussion. Virtually all of the laws focus on sexuality, gender identity, or race. In Missouri, a bill would ban teachers from using the 1619 Project, the New York Times Magazine issue which centers around slavery in American history and was released last fall as a book. Historian Heather Cox Richardson wrote, "In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis on March 28 signed a bill banning kindergarten through third grade public school teachers from talking about sexual orientation or gender identity, a measure its opponents have dubbed the Don't Say Gay law." The Walt Disney Company, which is the state's largest employer with 80,000 employees, did not take a position on the bill until finally, under intense pressure from inside the company, Disney's CEO, Bob Chapek, came out against the measure and promised the company would donate $5 million to LGBTQ organizations. DeSantis called Disney's opposition radical and tore into woke corporations. He has suggested that the Florida legislature should cancel Disney's special status in Florida, a status that essentially makes it a local government. Right-wing commentators have cheered him on, eager to use government power to retaliate against companies that bow to popular pressure in favor of Black rights, LGBTQ rights, and so on. Let's return to King's 1966 speech. In answer to his own question, what do we do when we find ourselves in such a period of revolution, he answered, it has always been the role of the church to broaden horizons, to challenge the status quo, and to question and break mores if necessary. I would like to suggest, he said, some of the things that the church must continually do in order to remain awake through this revolution. First, we are challenged to instill within the people of our congregations a world perspective. Secondly, it is necessary for the church to reaffirm over and over again the essential immorality of racial segregation. There is another thing that the church must do to remain awake, he continued. We must get rid of the notion, once and for all, that there are superior and inferior races. It is out of this notion that the whole doctrine of white supremacy came into being, and the church must take a stand through religious education and other channels to direct the popular mind at this point, for there are some people who still believe in this strange doctrine. The next thing that the church must do to remain awake through this revolution is to move out into the arena of social action. It is not enough for the church to work in the ideological realm and to clear up misguided ideas. To remain awake through this social revolution, the church must engage in strong action programs to get rid of the last vestiges of segregation and discrimination. He went on to talk about the importance of legislation for voting rights to prevent housing discrimination and so forth. And here we are in 2022 still working on these issues. I'm sure you are aware that on March 29th, President Biden signed into law the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill, making lynching a federal hate crime. Tegan Finn of NBC News reported this happened after more than a century of failed efforts in Congress to pass similar legislation. Congress had fallen short on passing anti-lynching bills more than 200 times since 1900. This enacted legislation will make it possible to prosecute a crime as lynching when a conspiracy to commit a hate crime results in death or serious bodily injury, with perpetrators facing up to 30 years in prison. Friends, when events call us to take a position on lynching, on police shootings of unarmed Black people, on war crimes and atrocities and numerous other examples, it is pretty obvious where we need to be. Sometimes, though, wokeness is more complicated. The incident that happened at the Academy Awards on March 27th is illustrative. For those of you who didn't see it or hear about it, comedian Chris Rock made a disrespectful and insulting joke about actor Will Smith's wife, Jada Pinkett Smith. Will then strode on stage and slapped Chris in the face. Public response to this action, some say, goes way beyond the incident itself. Reggie Jackson, an award-winning senior columnist for the Milwaukee Independent and co-founder of Nurturing Diversity Partners, wrote a column published March 30th called My Problem with How the American Public Reacted to Will Smith Slapping Chris Rock. He wrote, America has a bad habit of making the actions of one Black person somehow mean all of us are responsible. Whenever one Black person does something negative, it becomes a conversation about the flaws of all Black people in our so-called culture. This never happens when one white person does something bad. If this was one white man slapping another white man, I would guess that their race would not be mentioned. We should make something perfectly clear, he continued. Will Smith did not punch Chris Rock. He slapped Chris Rock after Rock unnecessarily insulted his wife. Will Smith felt the need, justified or not, to protect his wife from this verbal attack. In the public's response, very few people came to the defense of Jada Pinkett Smith and spoke about her husband defending her honor. For most of American history, Jackson continued, Black women have been disrespected. During the centuries of slavery and decades of Jim Crow segregation, any man could sexually assault a Black woman or girl anytime they chose to. No laws or law enforcement protected Black women. On the other hand, there were consequences, usually death, for any Black man who tried to defend his wife, daughter, or mother from the disrespect and assaults. Black men were forced to sit back and accept that they had no power to defend their loved ones. By the same token, white men would beat, kill, and lynch Black men and boys who even looked at a white woman or girl the wrong way. Nothing was more sacrosanct than the honor of white females. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black male, was murdered in 1955 because a white woman, Carol Bryant, accused him of flirting with her. The two men who kidnapped and murdered Till were acquitted by an all-white, all-male jury. Violence to protect the honor of white women has been the order of the day in this country for centuries. When Will Smith uses a slap to defend his wife, the world goes crazy. Comedian Tiffany Haddish had a different take on the slap. She said, When I saw a Black man stand up for his wife, that meant so much to me. As a woman who has been unprotected, for someone to say, keep my wife's name out your mouth, leave my wife alone. That's what your husband is supposed to do, right? Protect you. That meant the world to me. Now, you may or may not agree with Jackson's analysis, but do you hear how he complexifies and contextualizes what may have seemed simple at the outset? My point is not to condone violence. My point is that we should listen to a variety of viewpoints of people of color and not rush to judgment if we are not part of the demographic most affected by the situation. I'm guessing that many white UUs live in the tension between the desire to be woke and the reality that few of us are fully there yet. I think it may be more useful to recognize that awakening is a process. There is always something to learn. There is always an opportunity for humility. There are times when we make mistakes, when we don't stay woke, when we fall asleep despite ourselves. 3 of the Gospels in the Christian scriptures tell the story of Jesus going to the foot of the Mount of Olives to pray with his disciples after they celebrated the Passover meal and before Jesus is arrested. Mark tells the story like this. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Matthew tells a similar story, and so does the Gospel of Luke. But only Luke explains the disciples' sleep as because of grief. The disciples, remember, were following a revolutionary who wanted to overturn the imperialist power of the Roman occupation. They knew the dangers. Historians say death by crucifixion was not an unusual event in their time. It was a common tactic used by the Roman Empire to maintain power. The disciples had no doubt seen many, many other revolutionaries, or as they were called, bandits, executed by the state via crucifixion. The disciples had every reason to be overcome by grief. The amount of cruelty in the world that we witness daily can make our eyes very heavy. We, like Jesus' disciples, may be tempted to fall asleep because of grief. Yet our faith calls us to remain awake so that we can be ready to act. In a Christian Socialist interview, Dr. Cornel West was asked if wokeness and call-out culture is being used these days as a substitute for genuine action. He replied that Christians don't believe in canceling anybody. He said what is important is being fortified, being a fighter in the long run, not a sprinter. He asked, "Are you fortified for the long run? Do you have your cemetery clothes on? Are you coffin ready to live and die for something bigger than you?" The tune we heard our house band sing, "People Get Ready" by Curtis Mayfield, was released in 1965. It's about being ready for death while engaged in something much larger than you. According to Robert F. Darden, Mayfield said he originally wrote it in response to both the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and the deadly church bombing in Birmingham. Not surprisingly, "People Get Ready" became one of the most performed, most loved freedom songs of the movement. 50 years later, it was sung during the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and at the women's marches. What does fortified mean to us? It means engaging in a regular spiritual practice. It means being in community to learn from each other and care for one another. Fortify is what we do in church and what we take with us into the world. And it's not a one-time thing. Being fortified requires repetition. We need to nourish each other again and again, even and especially when we fail. Jesus' disciples swore they would stay with him, even unto death. But they didn't. They fell asleep. And when Jesus was arrested by the temple soldiers, his disciples deserted him and fled. We too are going to fail sometimes in the process of becoming woke, staying woke, and participating in the change our times demand. We can use that knowledge of our imperfection to cultivate a healthy humility, which in turn will help us along in the process of staying awake and staying with those friends who need us. May we be fortified together so we can be brave together. As the song says, "Don't need no ticket, just get on board." Dear ones, I'll leave you with these closing words by Arthur Foote. May peace dwell within our hearts and understanding in our minds. May courage steel our wills and love of truth forever guide us. May it be so.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah.